Presenting the distinguished international news commentator and foreign correspondent, Raymond Graham Swing. This is another of his programs known as World Events, on which Mr. Swing gives his interpretation of international affairs.
Hey, thanks for clicking on this video. As you can see, I played a music video by my good friend Munk Duane, who's a great musician and film composer. And this is his original single called Dangerous, and he asked me to animate the logo that he created for this video, which is, as we can see, in the form of this skull and crossbones, this really cool vector image that was created using Illustrator. And what I'm going to do is take you through the entire process of how I think about bringing a logo such as this to life, from importing it into Animate CC to making design decisions and setup decisions as to what I'm going to animate and how. So Munk sent me the Adobe Illustrator file with his logo in it. I didn't do anything to the Illustrator file itself. I didn't edit any of the artwork or the layers. In fact, I didn't even open it in Illustrator. All I did was start a new project in Adobe Animate CC, and I set it for a resolution of 1920 by 1080. I knew that the producers and the editors were going to create this video in 4K at a 16:9 aspect ratio. And since this is all vector, I didn't have to create the animation at 4K resolution. All I needed to do was a 16:9 aspect ratio. So I chose 1920 by 1080, and that's the resolution I chose inside of Adobe Animate. The frame rate is set at 30 frames per second. So with my document setup complete, choose File, Import, and then Import to Stage, and navigate to the file on your computer. So when I click open, the import wizard is going to pop up. And in this window, you have a few options. You can actually turn on or off various layers depending on what you want to get imported into Animate CC from the Illustrator file. I'm going to leave the place objects at original position box checked and all the other boxes unchecked. I don't want anything to be imported as a single bitmap image. I don't need to import any unused symbols. And setting the stage size to the same as the Illustrator artboard, no, I want to keep the resolution that I have currently inside of Animate CC, as I explained earlier. So all that's left to do is now just click the import button in the lower right-hand corner of this panel. All right, so now we got our entire Illustrator file inside of Adobe Animate with all of the assets, each in their own layer on frame 1. And I'm realizing now that it's much bigger than the stage size, but it's also a very square aspect ratio. So we're gonna have to make some adjustments to get it to conform more to the 1920 by 1080 canvas size. With everything selected, I'm gonna grab the free transform tool or hit Q on the keyboard, and I'm gonna scale everything down to get it to fit inside of my stage area. I'm holding down the Shift key to constrain the proportions of all the artwork, and then just position it where I want it, pretty much roughly in the center, just like this. I'll use the arrow keys to nudge it over a little bit as well. And so now what I'm thinking about is how to get this to conform to the same width. So I'm going to grab some of these background elements, namely this black square, or at least what looks like now a frame that I'm realizing has a cutout in the center of it, probably from that dark maroon shape that I see as well. So let's just, again, using free transform tool, let's just position this and size it so that it reaches all 4 edges. And now I'm going to select this maroon shape and widen that as well using the same tool. One of the decisions I'm going to have to make is whether or not I want to have this black shape be a full shape with no hole cut out in the middle of it on a layer behind everything, and have the red shape on a layer above it. What am I going to animate? How am I going to animate it? So I'm just kind of double clicking. Everything's grouped. Certain assets are grouped. So I just want to get familiar with each shape and how it was designed, or at least how Adobe Animate translated some of these shapes during the import process. I may make a decision now that I'll change later after I start animating. A lot of what I do is trial and error, and I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to animate first, but what I do know is I want to get everything at this stage perfect in terms of placement and size and the overall composition. And then what I like to do is work backwards and deconstruct the entire animation in the process of animating it. So for now here, everything, I'm still on frame 1. I haven't created any time or inserted any frames at all. I want to make sure that what I have here on frame 1 is going to be ultimately the final frame of the animated logo. So as we can see, the name across the top, Munk Duane, is overlapping the red area. I need to create more space, more of a border along the top. So I'm going to play around with, I think, this shape here, this red maroon shape here, and scale some things and make some adjustments. But I'm going to create a new bottom layer and just make my own black shape to give it a black background and deal with the red rectangle on its own. So that'll give me a little bit more editing flexibility. So that's looking pretty good to me. So let's just turn everything on, including the names, the name across the top, the copy. And I might want to move Munk Duane up a few pixels. So let's unlock that layer, select it, and using the arrow keys, I'm just going to nudge it up a little bit more. So it has a little bit more space below it. So that looks pretty good. Now what I'm doing is determining what I'm going to animate and how in sections or segments. So there's the red triangle behind him. There's the actual crossbones. There's the red circle with a shadow. There's the skull, and there are headphones as well. So I'm going to need some frames in my timeline here across all these layers. So I'm going to give myself about 5 seconds worth by selecting a range of frames and hitting F5, which is the insert frame keyboard shortcut. Oh, and before I forget, right around now, it's a good time for me to actually do a save as and give this file a proper name. So in an effort to time out the animation a little bit, I am going to move some of these keyframes down, namely the ones that have the crossbones, the skull, and the headphones in them. I'm going to move them to about the 1 second mark because I'm going to animate this red square first. I'm going to start converting almost everything to a symbol, and in many cases, multiple assets into a single symbol, and do a lot of the animation as nested animations inside of symbols. So again, knowing that I'm working backwards, I'm going to create 2 keyframes, one at the beginning and then further down my timeline for this red square. And then once I have those 2 keyframes, and I'm not really worried about the duration of the tween or the animation that's happening right now. I can always go back in and fine tune how long the animation is going to take by moving keyframes around. So for now, I'm going to create 2 keyframes. The second one is how the object is going to end up, which is what we already have, and go back to the first keyframe. And this is where I'm going to edit it. I'm going to use the free transform tool, and I'm going to scale it vertically. Next, I want to right click over any one of the frames in between these 2 keyframes on this layer. And in the pop-up menu, I'm just going to select Create Classic Tween. And now with one of the frames selected in this tween, I'm going to go over to the Properties panel, and I'm going to click on the Classic Ease Effect dropdown, and I'm going to select the Ease Out curve, and then select Cubic. This ease curve will start the animation of the red square appearing much faster at the beginning and then gradually getting slower towards the second keyframe. So you might want to take note of those steps because I'm going to be using Classic Tweens throughout this animation along with a cubic ease curve. All right, so now working from, let's say, back to front, the next object to animate is that triangle with the crossbones. And since they're on their own layer inside this keyframe, I want to move this keyframe back towards the beginning of the timeline itself, but just after the red square has been finished animating in. Now, upon looking at this, what I think I want to do is actually animate the triangle separate from the bones themselves. I have kind of an idea where I might have the triangle spin in to view, and then maybe have the crossbones. I feel like they could come in from out of frame at 45-degree angles, which might look cool. So I'm going to select the bones and then cut and paste them to a totally different layer. And let's just move that keyframe down a little bit further to give us some room to animate the triangle. Okay, And while we're at it, let me just start naming some layers. Since the crossbones are on this layer, I'll name it crossbones. And let's rename this layer triangle. Let's convert the triangle asset to a symbol and simply name it triangle. And since we know that this is the final resting position of the triangle, I'm going to create 2 keyframes to sort of bookend the motion, right, that we have yet to create, and then go back to the very first keyframe. And I'm going to select the triangle and then select scale and rotate. Let's set the scale to 5% to make it really small. I'm going to use a Classic Tween and right-click anywhere between these 2 keyframes and select Create Classic Tween. And let's click Classic Ease and select Ease Out and then the cubic curve. Next, I'll click on the Rotate dropdown and change Auto to Clockwise. And let's type in 3 as the number of rotations. And let's play that back. So that looks pretty good to me. I actually kind of like the fact that the center point is a little off center, which kind of creates this sort of oscillation / wobble kind of quality to the triangle itself. So next in the order of animations is going to be the crossbones. So I'm going to select all of the components that make up these bones and click F8 on my keyboard. And that's going to bring up the convert to symbol dialog. And I'm going to name this crossbones. So now that the crossbones are in their own symbol, I'm going to double click this symbol to edit it. And inside the symbol is where I'm going to animate these crossbones. So now I'm just selecting all the components that make up each bone. And with them selected, I am going to convert each of them into their own symbol. So let's hit F8 and name the first bone crossbones 1. And then I'll do the same for the second and just name it appropriately enough crossbones 2. One little trick I like to do is while I have both of the symbols selected, I'm going to cut them and paste them in place into their own layer. So by doing this, I get to basically kill 2 birds with 1 stone. If I right click and select distribute to layers, Animate will place each bone in its position on different layers, but also the layer name adopts the symbol name. So now I'm just going to clean up this timeline by deleting the empty layers that we no longer need. And once again, since we're working backwards and we know that these bones are going to end up in this position, I'm going to go forward in time to about the 1 second mark. I'm going to click and drag to select this frame across both of these layers and just hit F6 so I can insert keyframes. This marks the end point of this animation. And then I'm going to go back in time to the first frame, and that's where we're going to make our change. And now I know I want to try to see what it looks like if these bones fly in at 45-degree angles from above. So I'm going to select the first bone, and I'm actually going to hold down the Shift key. And what that's going to do as I drag this bone up and to the left, it's going to constrain it along a 45-degree angle for me. And now I'm just going to do the same thing with the other bone in the opposite direction. Now all that's left to do is just select a range of frames across these 2 layers. And in the highlighted area, I'm going to right click and select Create Classic Tween. And now while they're still selected, I'm going to apply an Ease Out cubic curve once again. And now we can see if I scrub or play the timeline back, we can see the bones animate in from outside of the frame. And if I want to make this a little bit faster or slower, I feel like it's a little too slow. I want them to come in a little bit quicker. I'm going to select by clicking and dragging a range of frames across both layers, right click over that selected highlighted area and just say remove frames. That's going to shorten the tween span, thereby making the animation a little bit faster. Now back out of the parent timeline, we can see that this graphic symbol is going to play just fine. One thing to note is that by default, graphic symbols are set to loop. That means this symbol containing the bone animation will just loop until I tell it not to. We only want this to play once. So with this graphic symbol selected on stage, I'm going to go over to the properties panel. Under the looping section, I'm going to click the middle icon with the arrow and the number 1 on it. That is to tell this symbol to just play once. And that's all it's going to do. I don't have to create any more keyframes. I don't have to do anything else. It's just going to play once and stop. So now the red circle directly behind the skull is next to animate. I'm realizing that the skull and the red circle are both on the same layer, so I want to separate them. So I'm just going to turn off the visibility of all the other layers so I can just concentrate on the layer that has the skull and the red circle. And using the selection tool while holding down Shift, I'm going to select the red circle and the shadow asset. And once selected, I'm going to hit F8 and convert them to a symbol. And I'm just going to name it circle. Once I click OK, the symbol is going to jump in front of the skull assets. So I'm just going to cut and paste in place the symbol on its own layer and then double click it. And I want to, I think, fade the shadow in over time. So I'm going to convert the shadow shape into its own symbol and place it on its own layer above the circle. So let's animate the shadow coming in as just a simple alpha transparency. So I'm going to create a couple of keyframes, one further down the timeline, start the shadow animation on frame 5. And on frame 5, the very first keyframe of the shadow, I'm going to select the instance of the symbol of the shadow. And in the color effects section of the properties panel on the right side, I'm going to click the drop down and select alpha. Now my slider is already set to 0% alpha. Yours may not be. It remembers the last setting that you used. So if it isn't at 0, just use the slider to set it at 0, which results in the shadow being completely invisible. And once again, I'm going to apply a Classic Tween by right-clicking over any of the frames in between these two keyframes. Now back out on the parent timeline, there are definitely some parts of this animation I want to retime. I'm not sure I like that the crossbones are coming in over the black. But for now, I want the triangle to start a little bit sooner. And I think maybe around the same time as the red square starts to animate in. And the crossbones start a little bit too late. I want these animations to overlap a little bit more. So the keyframe of the crossbones here on this timeline that has the crossbones symbol, I'm just going to click and drag that closer to the beginning. So the bones start coming in even before the triangle has finished animating. I also realize now that the circle I haven't fully animated yet. It just pops in. And I think what I want to do is just have it scale up and start a little bit sooner as well. So this is just a straightforward case of creating two keyframes, and in the first keyframe, scaling the symbol down very small, right-clicking, selecting Create Classic Tween, and with the tween selected, applying a cubic ease out curve. So the cool thing about this skull is obviously the design, but I love the headphones, and I think what I want to do is animate the headphones separately. So with all the assets of the skull selected, going to hit F8, convert them all to a graphic symbol, call it skull, and click OK. And while I'm at it, I'm going to select all of the assets that make up the headphones and convert that to a symbol as well. Now, there's one thing I want to do, which is going to require a little bit of editing back out here on the parent timeline, is this black border and red background, these two assets. What I think I want to do is, I don't like the way the crossbones come in from outside the stage over the black border. I think it would be really cool if they came in behind the black border and obviously over the red shape. So the way I have the parent timeline set up right now is that that black border is really just a big black background color. And the red shape is sitting on top of it. So what I'd like to do is actually create a cutout of the black border and place that above the red shape. In fact, above everything, so that the bones are on a layer below the black border, so that when they animate in, they're only seen when they enter the red area. So what I'm going to do is select and copy the red shape, and I'm going to go to the layer that has the black shape. I'm going to do a paste in place and break that apart so that the red shape is now pasted on top of the black shape. I'm going to deselect it, and then I'm going to select it again and hit delete. And what that's going to do is actually cut out a hole in the black shape that's the same exact width and height of the red shape. And then I have the hole that I want. And now my black shape is going to act more like a frame. And I'm going to select this black frame and hit F8, convert it to a symbol, and just name it frame. And now what I want to do is select the layer that the black frame is on and move that up so that it is above all of the animation, but still below the names that we see later on, Munk Duane and the title of the song Dangerous that appear, if you remember. So that'll be the third layer down. But I did like the fact that the animation started off all black. So now I'm thinking that I want to have a black background. So I'm going to create a new layer and basically move that to the bottom and create another black shape that spans the entire stage area, and just lock it and have that be what it is, just a black background. That way I can have the red shape animate over it, and just keep the black frame on its layer above everything. All right, so now let's actually tackle the animation of the skull. So I'm going to double click to edit the skull symbol itself. So it looks like when I imported the Illustrator file into Adobe Animate, the eyeballs came in as two different objects for some reason. So what I'm going to do is just select both of them, and I'm going to hit F8 and convert them to a symbol and just name it skull-I. And next I'll double click the symbol and just ungroup or flatten both of these grouped objects just to make sure that they merge into one shape. It's not completely necessary, but I just like doing it to make sure that the assets are as simplified as possible. And since both eyes are the same, I'm just going to click and drag while holding down the Alt key to duplicate the eye symbol, creating the other eye. And I'll just go ahead and delete the original right eye groups that were imported in with the original Illustrator file, since we don't need them anymore. And I'll just select them both and right-click to select Distribute to Layers. So next I'm going to select this, the nose or the left nostril, and convert it to a symbol, and I'll call it skull-nostril. And just like I did for the eye, I'm just going to hold down Alt, click and drag to duplicate it, since again they're both the same. Distribute to Layers, and I'll just go ahead and just delete that unneeded original right nostril. And now looking at the rest of the components, we have these assets for the right side of the skull, the teeth, and the jawbone. So I'm going to select the teeth on the left, hit F8, convert this to a symbol, as well as the teeth on the right. They are two different colors, so I'm going to keep them separate. I'm imagining that the skull can animate in from left to right and meet in the middle. And I'm also going to select the right half of the skull and hit F8, convert this to a symbol as well. And do the same for the left side of the skull. And I'll continue with the pieces for the jaw. Select and hit F8. You'll notice that when you convert something to a symbol, it pops in front of everything else. I'm holding down Control and using the down arrow, the up and the down arrows to arrange them forward or back. And so now everything is converted to a symbol. Select all of them, right click, and again, distribute to layers. And now I have all the components for the skull on their own layer. Now I'm going to go down the timeline, and probably around the 2-second mark, since these assets will be animated in from outside the stage, I'm going to add a little bit more time. Let's go to the 2-second mark, click and drag to select the range of frames across all layers, hit F6 to create my endpoint. Now I'll go back to frame 1, and holding down the Shift key, I'm just going to click and drag each of the left side components of the skull off the stage to the left, and do the opposite for all of the assets for the skull on the right side. By holding down Shift, it's just constraining them along the X-axis. And I'm going to select a range of frames across all the layers, right-click over the highlighted area, and select Create Classic Tween. And again, apply my cubic ease out curve. Now, when I play this back, you can see the components all animate in at the same time. I want to make it a little bit faster, so I'm going to select a range of frames, right-click over them, and select Remove Frames. It's going to shorten the Classic Tween span. And once I get it to the speed I like, I'm now going to concentrate on the order of each of these components in terms of how they animate in. I think one of the first things I want to animate in are the teeth. And then maybe I'll delay the skull itself. And then the nose very soon after that. And then I think the last objects to appear will be the eyes. And that seems pretty good to me. So let's just remove all the extra frames we don't want. Let's go back out to the main timeline. And I'm going to play around with the timing of the skull as a whole. Have that come in a little bit sooner since it takes a little bit longer. I realize now I think I want the red circle symbol that contains the shadow behind the skull to actually start playing further down the timeline. So I'm going to go to the second keyframe at the end of the tween span, click on the symbol, and set it to single frame. This is going to prevent it from actually playing the nested animation. And then I'm going to go further down the timeline a few frames, select a frame, hit F6 to insert a keyframe, click on the graphics symbol, and then go to Properties panel and click on the Play Once button. Now when the playhead gets to this third keyframe, it's going to play the nested animation once. And I'm going to repeat all those steps for the skull symbol so it only plays once as well. All right, so next I'm going to move on to the headphones. There's several ways I can animate this coming in, maybe as one piece, flying in from directly above the skull. But I think what I want to do is maybe try having the squares that go over his ears. I'm going to have them animate in by themselves. So I'm going to separate them from the part that goes over his head and distribute them each to their own layer. I'm going to keep them shapes for this and use a shape tween. So I've created my keyframes. I'm going to grab the free transform tool and I'm going to hold down the Alt key here on my Windows machine, and I'm going to grab one side and scale it horizontally so that it's just starting out as a thin line. And now with both of them ready to go, I'm going to apply a shape tween across both of these layers and apply my cubic ease out curve. And now for the top of the headphone, the part that goes over the head, I think what I'm going to do is reveal that through the use of an animated mask. So I'm going to create a new layer, right click next to the layer name and convert it to a mask layer. When I do that, the layer below automatically gets linked to the mask layer. So now in the mask layer, I'm going to take my rectangle tool and just a very high contrast color and create a shape. So what I'm envisioning is the headphone, this part that goes over his head, to appear to animate in from the center outward, left and right. Here I'm going to draw the mask shape directly down the center, but I want to make sure vertically that it is tall enough so that when I widen it, it's going to span and cover the entire asset of the headphone graphic that's going over the skull's head. So I just need to animate this shape. I'm going to create a keyframe a little bit further down the timeline. And in this keyframe, I'm going to grab the free transform tool and I'm going to widen this shape until it spans and covers the entire asset. I'm going to right click over the layer and create a shape tween. And once again, apply my easing out curve. And when I lock the layers, you'll see the mask at work. And now I want to time this as I scrub the timeline. I want to time this a little bit better so that these three components animate in a little bit more seamlessly. So I'm just playing with the timing of everything at this point. And I think that looks pretty good. So now back out on the main timeline, if I scrub my animation, I can start to see the overall timing of everything and make some adjustments if necessary. I think I'm going to have the headphones actually come in a little bit sooner. And this is actually starting to look pretty good to me overall. So now it's time to animate the artist name on top and then eventually the name of the song below. But here I'm noticing that for whatever reason, when I imported this from Illustrator, it imported in as a bitmap. So what I want to do is keep it vector so it's scalable. Remember, we're probably going to be exporting this to 4K from this file later. So with this bitmap asset selected, I'm going to go to Modify, Bitmap, and then select Trace Bitmap. And in the Trace Bitmap dialog box, I'm not going to actually change any of these default settings. I'm just going to hit preview to see what it looks like. And it looks pretty good to me. So I'm just going to click OK. And what Animate's going to do is convert the bitmap into vector shapes. Now I'm just going to go back out to the main timeline and with the artist name still selected, hit F8 and I'll convert this to a graphic symbol also. And I'm not going to do anything fancy in terms of animating the artist's name. I'm just going to go out to the main timeline, create an additional keyframe, and then go back to the first keyframe, select it, and I'm going to just color tint it black and apply a classic tween. So it basically just fades in from black. Now, the final component is the title at the bottom, Dangerous. So I'm going to select this and convert it to a symbol as well. And then I'll double click it because I'm going to do some animation inside this symbol because I see that the O in Dangerous has a circle and a cool X graphic that I think might be fun to play around with in terms of animation. So what I think I want to do is have this fun effect, pretty easy. It's just using scale and a classic tween, but this fun effect where both of these assets I'll animate them independently and have them start really big outside the frame and very quickly just sort of zoom into place one after the other. So the O first and then the X after it. So I noticed that the X is a bitmap. So because I'm scaling it really, really large, I'm going to trace bitmap this as well to convert it to vectors the same way we did the artist's name just a minute ago. I'm also realizing that the O itself is a bitmap, but since it's just a stroke, I'm going to just recreate it using Animate's oval tool and with no fill and just draw a circle that just contains a stroke in the same color. And before I animate the O and the X, I need to just convert them to symbols. And while I'm at it, I'm going to convert Dangerous to vectors and convert it to a symbol as well. So with Dangerous and the circle and the X, each on their own layer, I'm going to start to play with the timing of it. I'm going to have Dangerous fade in first, and then have the circle come in, and then the X come in that order. I'm going to extend the number of frames in this timeline. I'm just going to go out a few more frames and hit F5, which is the shortcut to insert frames. That gives me a bit more time to play with. And since the circle and the X are in their final resting positions, I'm going to just create keyframes at the end of this timeline. So now in the first keyframes for the O and the X, this is where I'm going to scale them much bigger than the actual stage. And I'm going to use the scale and rotate tool for this. And then right-click over one of the frames between the two keyframes on this layer and select Create Motion Tween. And then I'm going to apply an Ease Out cubic curve. And since I want the X to animate in just slightly after the O animates in, I'm going to select the range of frames in the X layer and just move them down further down the timeline a little bit. And then just repeat the same steps I did to animate the O, where I'm going to just, on the last keyframe, scale the X up much larger, and then right-click and then select Create Classic Tween, and then apply my cubic Ease Out. So back out on the main timeline, I can play back the animation. You can see everything builds in a really fun, cool way. Nothing that complicated was done animation-wise. Almost everything was done with Classic Tweens, and in some rare instances, I used Shape Tweens, and a lot of this was really just timing. At this stage, what I think I want to do is also bring the skull itself to life a little bit more. And for that, I am going to use this 2.5D effect. It's a fun way to bring an otherwise flat graphic to life. And if you're familiar with parallax animations, you'll understand how this is done, but I'm going to show you step by step how I do it. So if we just take a look back at the actual finished animation, you'll notice that the skull actually has this kind of cool 2.5D effect that's taking place. It looks like his head is rotating in space, looking left, looking right, looking up, looking down. So this is a really fun, cool technique where I'm kind of faking 3D. I'm using a parallax effect to create the illusion that the skull or the character is moving in more of a 3D space. And it's just using simple classic tweens with a bit of easing and a little bit of squash and stretch. But it's pretty effective. It can be applied to most designs, but it really does hinge on the design of the character. So I'm going to walk you through just exactly how I created this illusion. Ideally, I want to have the skull and the headphones animate in a loop, which will be a lot easier if it's animated nested inside a symbol. In order to do this, I need to convert both of these objects into a totally new symbol. So on the timeline, I'm going to hit F6, which will insert a keyframe in the layer that contains the headphones and in the layer that contains the skull. With both of these assets selected, I'm going to hit F8, which will convert both of these assets into a brand new symbol. And for personal timeline management reasons only, I am going to create a new layer and cut and paste this new symbol containing the skull and the headphones into it. And to edit the symbol, I'm going to double click it. And once I'm inside the symbol, I'm going to select both of the assets, which are the skull and the headphones, right click over them and select distribute to layers. Okay, next I'm going to select these symbols. I'm going to start with the headphone symbol and break it apart, hitting either Control B or Command B, depending on your platform. And now I have all the symbols that were nested previously, but I'm also seeing that that mask that we used earlier is also now been exposed or broken. So I just need to click that green shape that we used as a mask earlier and hit delete because we don't need it here. And let's select the skull symbol and break that apart also. And once again, with all the symbols for the skull selected, I'm going to right click over them and select distribute to layers. And I want to just clean up this timeline and delete some of the empty layers that are left behind. My next step here is just making sure everything is converted to a symbol. I know the headphone shapes are not because they were Shape Tweens before, so I had never converted them to actual symbols. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. The technique that I'm about to show you that involves rotating the head is going to take advantage of Classic Tweens and easing, and those can only be applied to symbols. So I just want to make sure everything on this timeline are indeed symbols. And in an effort to just keep this timeline organized, I'm going to right-click all of the three assets that are the new headphone symbols and right-click and distribute them to layers so that all my layer names are consistent. So now this next step is really important. Before I create any additional keyframes, I want to grab the free transform tool, select each individual symbol, and edit the center point, which is represented by this little white dot. I want to edit the center point to reflect how I want each of these assets to hinge properly. And for the headphones, the part that goes over the ears, I'm just going to move the center points to the outer edge. For the eyes, I'm going to leave the center points in the middle. They don't need to hinge in any other location. The nostrils, the center points can stay in the middle. For the actual jawbones, I'm going to actually hinge them where they connect to the skull itself. And I think the skull, the two halves of the skull, I'm going to move the center points down below and in the center. And for the headphones that go over the head, I'm going to move that down into the center. And I think the teeth can stay where they are. I think the center points are fine in the middle. Now with all my center points in place, I can go ahead and go further down the timeline and create keyframes at, let's say, the 1 second mark. The initial animation is going to be the head starting from this head-on or face-on view and then turning to the left. So the first step here on frame 30, or at the 1 second mark, I'm going to select some of the assets and start moving them or squashing them towards the left. So for instance, the eyes, the nose, I'm going to start moving them to the left. Everything that's further to the left side, I'm actually going to squash as well. Everything from that is on the right side of the skull, as it moves to the left, I'm going to actually make them a little bit wider. The symbol of the teeth on the right, as it moves over, I'm actually going to widen it. This is going to provide the illusion that it's facing us a little bit more than it was before. And once I get most of the assets repositioned and rescaled or squashed, I want to highlight a range of frames across the layers and apply a Classic Tween and just start scrubbing the timeline to just see how the effect is working and make adjustments from here. So I want to push the envelope a little bit further. I think I can get more out of this effect. As we can see, it's starting to look good, but I think we can make it even more convincing. So this part of the skull, this sort of center line of the skull, I want to push that further to the left. So I'm going to use the free transform tool and squash the left side a little bit more, move the nostrils over, move the eyes over. That left eye, I want to squash that a little bit more. Again, it's going to provide the illusion that it's moving away from us or wrapping around the skull in some sort of perspective, and just making lots of tiny adjustments. So everything in theory that is closest to us, like the nose and the eyes and the headphones, are going to move a little bit more. They're going to squash a little bit more. But everything a little bit further back or behind those assets are going to move a little bit less. So for instance, the teeth and even the jawbone. I'm going to zoom in here and edit these nostrils a little bit. Again, always checking my work. I'm going to scrub the timeline, see what it looks like. And I'm actually starting to like this a lot. And now I just want to click and drag and select across all of these Classic Tweens bands. And now I want to apply my ease in and out curve. And let's speed it up a little bit. I'm going to select a few of these frames and remove them. And let's see how that looks. So next I want to make the skull actually turn to the right as far as possible. So I'm just going to duplicate the frame 1 keyframes. And from here, I'm going to edit every asset by moving them over to the right-hand side a little bit. And again, like we did before, I'm going to start squashing and stretching them using the free transform tool. So I want to squash the right side of the skull a little bit more. And let's widen the left side a little bit more, because that's now, in theory, facing us more than it was before. And let's zoom in on this nostril. I want to just shrink it. Yeah, now the final part here is widening this left jaw. So now applying the Classic Tween along with an ease in and out. And when we play this timeline back, we're starting to see this skull look like it's moving its head back and forth. So now I'm just selecting keyframes, holding down Alt, clicking and dragging to duplicate them. And I find I'm constantly going back in to some areas of the animation and seeing how far I can kind of push the envelope. And I'm just using the arrow keys to nudge things a little bit further to see how far I can push it. And that actually feels pretty good to me. I'm trying to be consistent where some of these assets meet, because where they meet creates this vertical line or division between the left half and the right half. So I'm kind of using that as my guide. So if we just look at that line down the middle of his face created by these different colors, if that feels good to me, then this whole effect will be more and more convincing. So I'm going to click and select a range of frames that represent the full head turn and duplicate them further down the timeline to create a longer loop. And I just want to play with some of the timing here, but I think overall this is starting to look pretty good. So now I have a symbol that contains the skull animating by rotating its head to the left and then back and forth, left, right, left, right. So if I duplicate this symbol, I can edit them so that one symbol contains just the initial head turn from the point where he's just facing us to turning to the left, and then edit the other duplicate symbol so that it loops with his head turning from left to right and back again. Having a graphic symbol with just the looping animation of the head turning from left to right will allow me to just let it play and loop for as long as we need it to. So I'm going to duplicate this symbol and I'm going to call it skull turn. So I'm going to double click it and I'm going to edit it by deleting those frames where the head's rotating from left to right. And I'm just going to keep the animation where his head starts off facing us and turns to the left. So now in the next keyframe, we have the original symbol that we did all of the animated head turns in. I just want the animation to be the head turning from far left to far right and back again in a loop. Now back out on the main timeline, I have this symbol selected. I'm just going to make sure that it's set to loop in the properties panel in the looping section. And now for the last and final animation we're going to add to this is here on the main timeline. I'm going to create a few more keyframes in this layer where I'm also going to use the free transform tool, and I'm going to rotate the skull head symbol that contains the head turn animation. And what this is going to do is actually create an animation within an animation. And the cool thing about what's going to happen is I'm going to be rotating a symbol that contains an animation. So in a sense, I'll be layering animation to create an even more dynamic effect. And while I'm at it, and due to the fact that I just can't leave well enough alone, I'm going to double click the symbol that loops with the head turning left to right, back and forth of the skull, and add additional animation. I want to actually add animation where he not only looks left and right, but also looks up and then down, just to add a little bit more variation to the character. To add these animations, I'm simply going to create additional keyframes, and like I did before, using the same parallax technique with the free transform tool and repositioning assets, I'm going to create the illusion that his head is looking upward and downward. So enough of my yapping. I'm just going to speed up the video from here on out because you all should have the basic idea. I'm just, again, trying to create the illusion of this skull looking up and down using free transform and tweens. So I thought, let's mix it up and actually play some of Munk's song Dangerous. So check it out.
The world is raging and I need saving. My hope is fading. I'm thinking maybe you're not the person I knew for certain. Don't let it worsen. If it ain't working, it just don't feel right when your claims are black and white. I think you're lost in the shuffle, and that's trouble. You think you're smart as you carry the contagion while you drop the bar for the real information. Work so hard just to try to be outrageous, but you're dangerous, We're all starved for a single inspiration now that we're all marked for.
Okay, so now with those additional animations complete, I'm just back out on the main timeline, and I'm going to create a few more additional keyframes and rotating this symbol that contains the nested animations of the skull. And now once I apply the Classic Tween with some easing, again, I'm reinforcing the effect of layered animation. So we have a symbol that is being rotated, and then inside the symbol, we have that parallax animation of the skull that is looking like it's turning left to right and up and down in space. And it's creating a very dynamic and fluid motion. Thanks for watching. Please check out the actual music video from Munk Duane. I'm going to add a link in the description. And if you watch the video, you'll notice that there's actually more animation within the video itself, mostly typography related animation. And that was also done using Animate CC. Please feel free to comment below with any questions regarding animation and Animate CC. I do my best to reply to every single one of you. Please like and subscribe, and until next time.
Dangerous.